Hello, welcome to Video Bread. My name is Steve and I'll be instructing you on how to bake bread at home. It's delicious, nutritious, and great fun. Bread baking has become a lost art. Maybe a generation or two ago, your mother or grandmother made bread for the family. Today, people just don't know how anymore. They forgot. They think that they don't have the time. What I'd like to do is I'd like to teach you in this video how to bake bread at home quickly, efficiently, with consistent results, and in a cost-effective manner. We'll begin by making what I call video white bread, and once we've mastered our loaf of white bread, then we'll go on to make other breads and pastries, anything with yeast. To get started, we'll go to our list of ingredients for video white bread. We'll begin with 2 tablespoons of yeast, 2 cups of water at 110 degrees, and I actually measure the temperature of the water, 1.5 cups of water warm, nothing more than 110 degrees, 1/4 cup of sugar, 1 tablespoon of salt, 3 tablespoons of oil, and between 8 and 10 cups of flour. Let's make some bread. To get started, I'm using a glass bowl. You could use metal or plastic, it doesn't matter. But I took my bowl and I ran some hot water over it in the sink and let the bowl come to temperature. I'm starting with a warm bowl. Throughout the bread baking process, I'll be talking a lot about temperature and regulating the temperature of the whole process. Very important. Our first ingredient is 2 tablespoons of yeast. We'll go ahead and place 2 tablespoons of yeast in our warm bowl, and we're going to let the yeast sit for 5 minutes to come to room temperature. The yeast was stored in the refrigerator prior to this, so it's cold. And we want to start with a warm bowl and with warm yeast. I'm buying the yeast in 2-pound packages, and you can find yeast in the store in small 1/4 ounce packets. There are 2 major brands in my area, and they each have something that's I'd think of as a normal product, a normal yeast, and then they have one that one claims to be quick rise, the other claims rises 50% faster. That's what I'm using in the 2-pound packet. It's an institutional or a food service product. It's the faster acting yeast. That's what I want you to use. Now, as the yeast is coming to temperature, I'll talk a bit about the type of yeast. It's an active dry yeast versus a cake yeast. You can't get cake yeast anymore. It's not available to the general public. By buying yeast in the 2-pound package versus the small packets in the store, it's much more cost effective. A friend of mine who makes bread, he told me that he never found it to be any less expensive than buying bread in the store. Well, 1 small packet goes for about 30 cents. The same amount of yeast, if you buy it in quantity, costs between 2 and 3 cents. We'll be using 3 of these in our recipe, and it's just not cost effective to use the small packets. If you're going to do any serious bread baking, you need to find yeast in quantity. You can find it in membership stores, warehouse stores, stores that sell to the public and to businesses. I've seen it in rural areas in bins or hoppers. A store may buy a 50-pound or 25-pound bag and dump it into a hopper. You can buy it loose. Store it in a plastic bag or container in your refrigerator. It lasts for a good long time. Now, one thing I could mention about the amount of yeast we used, I need to stress this really, I'm calling for 2 tablespoons of yeast. A packet is not a tablespoon of yeast. Years ago, a packet was nearly a tablespoon of yeast, but today a packet is about, or maybe a little less than, 2 teaspoons. So I'm using a tablespoon. This is 2 teaspoons. If, to make your first recipe, if you can't find yeast in quantity and you go and get the packets from the store, that's great. But you'll need to use three packets. When I read a cookbook, recipes generally call for, a packet, 1 packet of active dry yeast. They're using 2 teaspoons. When I make that recipe from a cookbook, I go ahead and I use a tablespoon. I'm using 50% more yeast than they're calling for. I'm also using the faster acting yeast. And it works for me. I first discovered the concept of using more yeast. I had a problem years ago. My bread wouldn't rise. I wouldn't get a big full loaf. My bread was heavy, and it was good for toast, but not much good for sandwiches. And I was told by a relative back about 5 years ago, told me that that's what homemade bread is all about, that you can't get a big full loaf when you make it yourself. And that's just not true. I found that not to be true. By using more yeast, my loaves blow right up. I don't have a problem with rising when it comes time for the first rising. If you look in cookbooks, they'll say take your dough and cover it with a towel, set it in a draft-free area. Some of them will say put a pan of boiling water in the bottom of your stove, then put the bowl with a towel over it in the stove. I don't have to do any of that because I'm using more yeast. Where I first stumbled on that idea is sort of funny. I was watching a Saturday morning Three Stooges story, and Curly was a baker, and he was mixing didn't know what he was doing, of course. He was mixing the flour and the water, making bread, and it came time to add the yeast. And they had cake yeast and yeast. How much yeast? Well, he didn't know, so he just took gobs and gobs of yeast, and he left the room, mixed it in, left the room, and it blew up. It blew out of the oven, and it filled up the room, and made a big mess. It was a fiasco. Well, that gave me the idea. The problem with my bread was in the rising, and I tried using more yeast, and it really helped me out. It worked. Well, what I'd like to do now is, that's been about 5 minutes. Our yeast has been sitting in the bowl, in a warm bowl, and it's at room temperature. I'm going to go ahead and add our second ingredient, which is 2 cups of water at 110 degrees. And I'm using a candy thermometer. I'm actually measuring the temperature of the water. That's very important. You can get a candy thermometer in most stores. This is what I recommend that you use. So I'm going to go ahead and put my 2 cups of water in with the yeast, and I'm going to let it sit and soak for 7 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and set my little kitchen timer. I found that using a timer in bread baking is very helpful. Our first step, we just let the yeast sit for 5 minutes. If you set your timer, you can do other things. You don't have to worry about it. When the buzzer goes off, do the next step, which is add 2 cups of water at 110 degrees. Very helpful. You can sit down now. You have 7 minutes. You can sit down and have your coffee. Relax. Take it easy. Bread baking doesn't take that long. It may take you 20 minutes to make bread. The process takes 3 hours, but it's like doing the wash. You put the wash in the machine, and the machine does the work. All you do is put it in and then take it out. Anyway, as that's soaking, I'll explain to you a bit of what we're doing. Yeast is an organism. It is grown in large vats in water. Then it's dehydrated. The water is removed, and at that point the yeast goes into a dormant state. What we're doing is we're reactivating the yeast. It's active dry yeast. We're reactivating the yeast by adding the water at a temperature of 110 degrees. The temperature is very important. I'm using a temperature of 110 degrees, and that's arbitrary, but it's part of my formula. Yeast will actually come alive anywhere between around 70 and 140 degrees. But up around 140, you'll kill the yeast. It'll do us no good. At around 70, the yeast will come alive, but it will take too long. We're trying to time the release of the gas. The yeast, when it comes alive, gives off a gas. It gives off carbon dioxide gas and alcohol. The alcohol dissipates and isn't an issue, but the gas is what makes our bread rise. It mixes with the gas mixes with the flour, or it makes the flour and water mixture blow up like a big balloon. That's what we want. If we used a temperature of around 70, it would take too long. We're trying to time the release of this gas into the rising of our bread. We have a window, a time frame of about 3 hours. We're going to mix the ingredients together. We'll go through 2 risings before baking, and we want that gas to be given off in that period into our bread to get a big full loaf. If we use a temperature of, say, 125, the gas might be given off too fast. The gas might be gone and wouldn't be there for our second rising. So 110 is the temperature we want to use. That's what I recommend. What I'm going to do now is give you a close-up of the yeast. At this point, yeast comes in granular form. When mixed with the water, it forms a milky solution. Nothing's happening. I'll give you a close-up of this. We can call this our before picture. Nothing's happening. I'll come back at about the 5-minute mark and we'll see the yeast coming alive. It's been about 5 minutes and we can see the yeast now is coming alive. It's taking the water back, it's being rehydrated, and it's blooming, blossoming. There's a lot of names for it. But this is called proofing the yeast. We are proving that the yeast is in fact active and that it will work for us in our bread making. Like I say, when the yeast comes alive, it's giving off gas. This gas is what's going to fill our bread and give us a big full loaf. We want to trap this gas into our dough. We don't want to lose it all. So that's been 7 minutes. We'll go on to our next step. We're going to go ahead now and add 1.5 cups of water at 110. And we'll stir that with our wooden spoon. We always use a wooden spoon in baking. Then we'll add 1/4 cup of sugar. That'll be our sweetener. We could use honey, molasses, brown sugar. You have a lot of options when you make your own bread. You can make it more nutritious. You can add wheat germ, say. Instead of using all water, we could have used half milk. Now we'll add 1 tablespoon of salt. Again, you could add 2/3 of a tablespoon, 2 teaspoons. You could make it with no salt. It wouldn't have much flavor at that point if you did that, but I like to limit the salt in my diet. I'm stirring it with a spoon and I can feel the granules, the grains of salt and sugar, and I'm going to stir until I know they're dissolved or melted into the mixture. And that's about right. I'm going to add 3 tablespoons of oil. And this is a vegetable oil. You could use shortening, margarine, but with no milk and no animal fat in here, we have no cholesterol in our bread. I'll go ahead and stir that in a bit. And we'll begin adding our flour. Now, to measure flour properly, you'd dip a measuring cup. This is a dry measuring cup into the flour and scoop the top off to get exactly a cup. But I don't bother with that. I'm using between 8 and 10 cups of flour. It's all relative. When we come to the kneading, we'll be adding flour by the handful, so we don't need to be that precise at this point. I'm going to go ahead and put about 2 cups in my mixture, and another 2 cups. I'll mix it with my spoon to some extent here. And then I'm going to go ahead and beat it. I'll use my beater. I'm going to use a small beater and nothing special. I'll use the fastest speed. And I want to beat this thoroughly. It's very important that I beat this thoroughly. When it comes time to knead, it'll help us. The more we mix this yeast in now, one of the objects of kneading is to mix the yeast thoroughly. So by beating this a lot at this point, we're helping ourselves. We're saving time down the road. Does a good job. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and take my implements and submerge them in water also. Flour and water make paste. If we clean as we go, we won't have a problem, but if you wait, you'll have a real mess. Clean as you go is a good rule. And I'm going to go ahead and add 2 more cups. So that's 6 of my 8 to 10 cups. I'll mix that in with my spoon as best I can. At this point, I think of this as a batter. It's still soupy. We have 6 of our 8 to 10 cups of flour in here. I don't think of it as a dough until it firms up more, until we have more flour. So at this point, it's still what I'd call a batter. We'll go ahead and add 2 more cups of flour, our 1 cup at a time. Whoa! Our 7th and 8th cup. Doesn't matter if I make a mess on the counter here because I'm going to be kneading here. So there's my 7th cup. Mix that in again with my spoon as best I can. And that's good. Go ahead and add my 8th cup. So I've got 8 of my 8 to 10 cups of flour in my dough. It's now a dough. And I'm ready to dump it on the counter and begin forming it, working it into a ball, one big chunk, so that I can begin kneading. I'll go ahead and dump it out. And I'll take my hand and rub the inside of the mixing bowl to get the remainder of the ingredients out. And then I'll take the bowl and submerge this in water also. This would be a real problem to clean if I let this dry on here. I'll take my 9th and 10th cup of flour, and I'll take a handful, put it on my dough, clean off my spoon and submerge it. We're through with the spoon at this point. And I'll start working this into a ball or one chunk as I think of it. Right now it's gooey, real sticky. I couldn't get this off my hands if I tried. But as I add more flour, it will dry out and become easier to work with. At this point, we're forming our ball. We're not kneading yet. We haven't begun kneading yet. Add some more flour. I'll just keep adding flour until I have about 9 cups here. And like I say, you can use between 8 and 10 cups in this recipe. It varies on a lot of things, by how much flour you put in. The humidity of the day is an issue. But it's a rough measurement. Take a little more flour and clean this off my hands. Now we're starting to work this into our ball of dough. Okay, that's pretty well formed. There's what I call a well-formed ball. It's not as sticky anymore. I can get the rest of this off my hands, and we have something we can work with, and we'll begin the kneading. Now, part of my formula is that you knead for 10 minutes. Again, I'll set my kitchen timer for 10 minutes, and we'll begin the kneading. In kneading, we're doing 2 things. Number 1, we're thoroughly mixing the ingredients. We're trying to mix the yeast throughout our dough evenly, mix it thoroughly and completely. And number 2, we are adding as much flour as the dough needs or requires. And that's as simple as it sounds. As you work with the dough, you'll find that, as you knead, you'll find that the dough gets sticky or tacky. It starts sticking to your hands and the counter. And at that point, the dough is telling you that it needs more flour. So you're going to add a little flour at that point. What you do is you add as little flour as possible. Just take a small handful, sprinkle it around on the dough, on your hands, and do some more kneading. And keep kneading until it gets sticky and until the dough tells you it needs a little more flour. Try to add as little flour as possible. Now when you're kneading, I say go for 10 minutes. If you go for 10 minutes, that'll be fine. You can't over knead. You couldn't knead this too much. It's really hard to under knead. You could go for maybe 5 minutes. That might be enough. So remember, we've mixed with our beater. We mixed the yeast thoroughly through about half of the recipe. When we had 4 cups of flour, we mixed the yeast thoroughly throughout the batter. It was a batter at that point with our beater. That's the idea of beating really well. It helps you at this point. You don't have to do as much kneading. Okay, it's ready for a little more flour. It's getting sticky. I'll give you a close-up here in a bit, too, of the kneading. If you've never made any bread before, it may be very helpful to you. I remember when I first started, I read a cookbook, a paragraph in a cookbook, and they had one diagram, and it was very difficult to understand. Well, a picture being worth 1,000 words, this may be very helpful to you. Some other checks in the kneading to see if you have kneaded enough are stick 2 fingers in, and if the indentations spring back immediately, you've kneaded enough. And also, when you're working with the dough, you can actually feel it. At some point, the dough will firm up and start to spring back at you. It'll spring back at you. Now, when you're kneading, you can really work it up, put some muscle and some force into it, take your aggression out on the dough. Or, you don't have to be a big person. You can use your body mechanics. Fall into the dough. Use your motion. Fall into the dough. Body mechanics. It's up to you. But like I say, 10 minutes is how long it takes. The kitchen timer is great again also. You don't need to think about it. You can be miles away in your mind while you're kneading. I'd like to talk a bit also about flour. I'm using a bread flour. And a bread flour, what I define as a bread flour, is a flour that has 14 grams of protein per cup. And if you look at the nutrition information on the bag, it will tell you how many grams of protein the product has. Bread flours have been available to the general public. You can get it in your grocery store since the early 80s. You could use an all-purpose flour. An all-purpose flour has 11 grams of protein per cup, but bread flour will give you a bigger, fuller loaf, and that's what I recommend that you use. I'm going to go ahead and give you a close-up of the motion of the kneading. If you watch it, it might be very helpful to you. You can see the dough needs more flour. It's sticking to the counter. So I'll take some flour, spread it around, and give you a look at the motion here. What we're doing is we take our ball and we push in the center. I'm right-handed. I'll take my right hand, fold it over, and turn 90 degrees, a quarter of a turn. It's a push, fold, turn. You just watch the motion. You're really folding and turning at the same time. And that's kneading. You just watch the motion here a bit. And every time it starts to get tacky or sticky, starts to stick to your hands or the counter, it means it's time to add a little more flour. I can start to feel this now firming up. It's just now starting to spring back at me. And it hasn't been 10 minutes yet. I'll go ahead and knead for 10 minutes, but this dough is almost kneaded enough at this point. Now it's getting sticky. It's sticking to my hand, so I'll just use a little more flour. The dough is telling me it's time for a little more flour. I'm going to go ahead and complete the kneading off camera, and when I come back, we'll be ready to place the dough in its mixing bowl for the first rising. Well, I've completed the kneading, and I'm ready to put the dough in a clean mixing bowl for its first rising. I'm going to coat the bowl with some oil. You could use margarine or shortening, whatever you're using. And I'll just rub it in with my fingers, coat the bowl, and put the dough in. I'll move the dough around a bit to coat the surface. That's all we're doing here by greasing the bowl. When the dough rises, we don't want the surface to dry out. Again, I'll use my buzzer, and our first rising will be for 40 minutes. I'd like to say also, we're talking about the protein in the bread flour. The protein is what forms the gluten in the flour, and the gluten is what makes the dough elasticy and allows the dough to stretch and hold the gas that the yeast gives off. It'll be 40 minutes. I'm going to give you some close-up time-lapse photography of the rising. It's pretty neat to watch. I think you'll like it.
It is fun to watch. There it goes. It's going to blow up like a big balloon. Where you're at in the country and the time of the year has something to do with how long you're going to let it rise. This is Seattle in the winter, 40 minutes. Las Vegas in the summer might be 30 minutes. If you're in the Northeast somewhere and it's really cold, it might be a little more than 40 minutes. So it's all relative based on where you are.
It looks great. It's doubled in size, which is what we want. Another check is to place 2 fingers in the dough, and if the indentation remains, which it has, it's fine. We're ready to punch down the dough, just like it sounds. We're removing the gas, the air, the carbon dioxide that the yeast gave off. Go ahead and put it on our counter, and we'll cut it in half. Careful not to cut your counter. If one piece of dough is bigger than the other, that loaf will end up being a little bigger. Now we're going to roll it out. We'll take a rolling pin, and we're trying to roll the dough into long strips. We're removing the air. That's all we're doing in the rolling. Ideally, the width would be 9 inches. The width of the pan by however long it rolls out is fine. We'll start at one end, roll it up tightly, and when we get to the end, we'll crimp it with our fingers. Push down with your fingers so that it makes a nice tight seal. And when we put it in the bread pan, we want the seal to be on the bottom so that it doesn't unroll during the rising. And that one's ready to go. We'll go ahead and do the same with our other loaf. Again, we're removing the air. We'll start at one end and roll that tightly. Crimp the end. And that's ready. Now I'm using 2 9x5 bread pans. You can use pans with a no-stick coating or not. doesn't matter. I'll put a bit of oil in each one, margarine, shortening, whatever you're using. And I'll rub it in with my fingers to coat the pans. And I'll go ahead and place the dough in the pan, and I'll spin it in a circular motion, again to coat the surface so that it doesn't dry out in the rising. Leave the seal on the bottom. Same with this one. And these are ready for the second rising. Now, we're going to let these rise for an hour and a half. That's a long time. We could bake them after an hour, but I like to let my bread over-rise. After an hour and 10 minutes, we'll go ahead and preheat our oven. We'll turn the oven on to 375 degrees. And I'll give you some time-lapse photography.
They look great. We'll just watch those blow up. They look nice. One thing I could say here is that I'm using an hour and a half rising time in Seattle in the winter. Now in Las Vegas in the summer, it takes about an hour. If you're in a colder place, it may take longer. Basically, the loaves are going to rise to a point, and then they're going to get so big they'll start falling over the sides of the pan. And you don't want that. If they over-rise, punch the dough down, roll it out again, let them rise again. The dough will rise again. There is an optimum baking time, some point at which the loaves blow up before they start to fall over the sides of the pan because they're too big. You want to bake at that optimum time. Another thing I could say is that the bread pans I'm using are, if you look at the picture, they're dark. They're a coated no-stick surface, but they're dark pans. And I tried one time using the steel pans, the silver pans, and it didn't work. The bottom of the loaves wouldn't cook properly. It takes longer to bake if you're using the silver pan. So I recommend that you use the dark pans, the no-stick surface coated pans. I can even, with my no-stick surface pans, I can even cook without greasing the pan. It's nice. I like the no-stick surface.
It's time to center our loaves in our preheated oven. In the first few minutes of baking, the loaves will get what is called oven shoot or oven spring. They'll get a little bigger, and in 22 minutes we'll have some bread. They look great. We're going to have some really nice loaves here. The moment of truth. Oh, they look great. Homemade loaf, you made it yourself. These are fabulous. You can knock on it a bit listen for a hollow sound to see that they are in fact done. Look at that loaf. That is beautiful. You can only make that at home. Great. Another nice one. Now, I placed the loaves on the other rack from my oven, and you want to take the loaves when they're done baking, remove them immediately from the pans and place them on racks to cool. At this point, you need to wait about 3 hours to cut into these. They're hot. You'll just rip it apart with other than a really sharp serrated knife or an electric knife. You could eat it now, it's up to you. But in about 3 hours, they'll be great. And I let them sit for about 24 hours before I think of packaging. At that time, I use either a plastic bag, and that'll act as a vapor barrier. The moisture won't get out. It'll keep the bread softer. Or a paper bag, like French bread comes in a paper bag, and it'll give you a different effect. The bread will be allowed to breathe through the paper bag. It'll dry out different and give you a little different texture in the crust. At this point, I think that you should go ahead and try making video bread. Rewind the tape, give it a try. If I could give you some advice, I'd say follow directions. Probably the most important thing that I could do most important advice that I could give you would be follow directions. Well, we've proved that you don't have to be a little old lady from Romania to make bread. And you don't need a stone oven. You can do it at home. Give it a try. Good luck on your first attempt. This is the second segment of Video White Bread, and what we're going to do now is we're going to shape the loaves in some different ways, and we're going to treat the crust in some different ways. To this point, I made Video White Bread over again, but I increased the recipe by 50%. I made 3 loaves, what we would put in 3 bread pans. And I'm going to go ahead and punch down the dough, remove the air as best I can. Now, I let this rise in my wok since I'm making a batch 50% greater than our previous recipe. It wouldn't rise in our normal mixing bowl, so I used a wok. And you could use a large plastic. An example, here's something I picked up at a Dollarama sale, one of the local stores, but anything. Just something a little bigger. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take my dough and I'm going to cut it in thirds. Remember, I have 3 loaves, as best I can without cutting my counter. I'll take 3 pieces of dough and then I'll cut each of those again in half. I'll have a total of 6 pieces of dough, and we'll make 6 different loaves. Okay, now with our 6 pieces of dough, I'll give you an idea of some of the pans available to you. These are French bread pans. They're a pretty good deal, about $11 for the set. They're actually baguette pans, and they came much smaller. I bent them and made them bigger. These are a pretty good deal for making French or Italian bread. Here's another example. This is about $20 for a bread pan. Remember, we're going to shape the dough differently other than a loaf of bread. Here's the same type of thing, but it's perforated, and it'll give you a different effect in the crust. For making a free-form loaf, a round loaf, a lot of times I'll use a pie tin, and the shaping will help it take a bigger form rather than just a flat surface. We can use glass, anything you have in the house, for free-form loaves or dinner rolls. We could use a pizza pan, broiler pan, the bottom section of your broiler pan, a cookie sheet, anything you have. You have a variety of types of things you can do. The bread will take the shape of the pan, basically. Okay, so let's start out by we'll use this one. We'll make some long, what we'll call, it looks like French bread. And get some of this out of my way here. Now, I'm not going to roll out this dough with a rolling pin. I'll just take it and I'll form it into a long. Let me move some of this out of the way here so you can see. But I'm going to just roll it out into a long piece of dough. Okay? Now that looks like a French bread at this point. And then I'm going to take it and throw it on the counter. Okay, now that's actually removing the air, just like we would with a rolling pin. That little rolling may look funny. Now I've pre-greased this pan prior to being on camera here, but I'm going to take a little cornmeal in my hand, and I'll sprinkle it on the pan. That will stop the bread from sticking. It'll make it easier to remove when we're done baking. I'll take my loaf, set it in the pan. Do the same with another. Roll it out, make it long, like a big long hot dog. And again, I'll take it and throw it on the counter. I'm removing the air doing that. There's actually a reason for doing that. And that looks fine. So I have two, we'll call these, you know, it looks like French bread, but really the recipe for video white bread, because it has no milk in it, it's really Italian bread. When you try the bread, you may notice the similarities, but with no milk, it's Italian bread. If we took the oil out, if we made the same recipe and didn't put any oil in, that would be French bread. That's all it is. So anyway, those two are ready to be coated and dealt with. Let's take our pie tin, which is coated also. We'll put a little cornmeal in that. Just sprinkle it around so that the bread will come out of the pan easy when we're done. And we'll take a chunk of our dough. Again, throw it on the counter. So we didn't roll it out. Form it into a round ball as best we can. Nothing special. And there's a free-form loaf. That will be a round loaf. Okay? Now, let me see. I have 3 more pieces of dough. So I'll go ahead and try another pan. Okay, we'll make 2 more loaves of French bread. This is greased also, pre-greased. Actually, Italian bread. The shape may not be what you think of as Italian bread, but that's really what the recipe is. Okay, and I'll take my dough and again I'll shape it, just make it long and thin. Okay, it might look funny to be throwing the dough on the counter here, but it works. We'll get it at about the right shape. Put it in our pan. This one actually looks a little too big. I'm going to cut the end off and I'll use that for something else. Okay. Maybe I'll take a little piece of this dough also. Cut it down in size. We'll save some of that for dinner rolls or something. That one looks good too. And I guess we could go ahead and let's make some dinner rolls. We'll take a glass baking dish. This is pre-greased also. We won't bother with the cornmeal on this one. And let's go ahead and we'll roll this out a bit like we would a loaf of bread. Just for some variety here. Just roll it into whatever, roll out the air. We'll roll it up and make something with it. What? Who knows? Let's see what we have when we're done. Okay. There's a long strip of dough. We'll cut it in thirds. Careful not to cut my counter. And maybe what I'll do is I'll just work with them, make them a little longer. And I'm going to set them on my pan. I'll make them long cylinders. It's a good idea. We'll make some dinner rolls. We'll take a long cylinder and we'll just fold it into a circle. I'll give you a close-up of all these in a bit, but it'll be a little dinner roll. Just with some of our dough. We can make anything. We can make hamburger buns. We could, like I say, if you like the taste of French bread, remake your video white bread. Don't put any oil in it, and it's French bread. We could make pizzas. I'll be going into pizzas in a bit, some of the tricks with pizzas, but there we go. It's a little circle. Same thing, I'm just making a long strip and I'll just fold it into a circle. There we go. And let me see, we have one piece of dough left. We'll go ahead and cut a piece of it off, roll it out, and make a few more dinner rolls. These are great for company. If you have company over for lunch or something, you can serve some hot homemade rolls right out of the oven and they'll be really impressed, believe me. But once you've made the dough, anything you can make with white dough, you know, you have the ingredients here. Okay, Same thing, we'll cut it in thirds, roll it into a cylinder, fold it over. These look a little smaller, so these will be some smaller dinner rolls. Because say we could be making hamburger buns. You can shape it any way you want. It's your dough. Do what you want. Have fun. Okay. And we have one piece of dough left. I think what we'll do with that is go ahead and we'll use our pizza pan. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll grease the pan. Put a little oil on it. I'll go ahead and sprinkle some cornmeal on so it won't stick. This is optional, the cornmeal, but it helps. If you don't have a no-stick surface, this will be very helpful. And when you buy French bread, say at the store, there's a little cornmeal on the bottom of that. It gives you the same effect. We'll take this and remove the rest of the air. Just form it into a ball of dough. Maybe throw it a couple times. It looks funny throwing the dough, but that helps. And there's another free-form loaf. Now that one will be smaller than this one. This is a lot more dough. Maybe what we'll do is switch these. Since this is more dough, we'll put it on the bigger pan. So what we have now is we have 4 that are shaped like French bread. We have 2 free-form loaves, and we have a few dinner rolls. We could have just made more loaves in loaf pans, but we're shaping them differently now. Another thing we can do is we'll put some cuts, slashes in the top of the crusts. Now on a long, thin loaf, it's traditional to put 3 slashes. Take the knife and just put 3 cuts, 3 slashes in the crust. On a free-form loaf, we put 3 slashes, make a pattern like an oversized tic-tac-toe board. Anything you want, really. It's more tradition than anything. On this one, we'll put a couple slashes. It just looks nice. We won't slash the dinner rolls at all, but when the loaf comes out of the oven, they look pretty that way. Okay, so we've formed our loaves differently. Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to treat the crusts. There's a number of things we can do. I've taken an egg, 1 egg, and a tablespoon of water, mix it up with a fork. I can paint my loaves. Take a little brush, and I'll just paint the top of my loaves. Now you can do this now. We'll do one now. The others we'll do prior to baking. And these now are ready for the second rising. Again, we'll go for an hour and a half. And what we'll do when I come back, prior to baking, we'll go ahead and do we'll treat the crust in different ways. We'll talk about some other options that we have. But these look pretty good. Now, when we do bake these, say we're going to let them rise for an hour and a half, we won't be able to bake all this at once. So we'll stagger them into our oven. Maybe we'll cook 2 things at a time based on what pans will fit in the oven. So I won't bother with the time-lapse photography this time. I'll just come back when we're ready to bake. Well, we're done with the second rising. You can see what we've made. Everything looks great. We're ready to treat the crusts. We'll treat them all a little differently to come up with different coloring, texture, crispiness. There are a variety of things that we can do to treat our crusts. We coated one of our loaves prior to rising with some egg. We took an egg, put it in a little cup, tablespoon of water, beat it up. You can use the egg white alone, the egg white with water, the egg yolk alone, the egg yolk with water, anything you want with an egg. We treated one prior to rising. We'll go ahead and take our little food paintbrush and we'll paint one of the other loaves with egg. And what this will do, it won't really change the flavor of the bread at all. This is all really for looks. Anything you do with this will give us a darker color. So that'll be pretty good. Another thing we can do now is we can take, I've got here a half a cup of water, and I put in a half a tablespoon of cornstarch. And we'll go ahead and paint maybe our dinner rolls with this. And again, this will make the crust shiny, the surface shiny, and you can just give it a try, see what you think. Great. Okay, another thing we can do is go ahead and paint our paintbrush again. I have some just melted butter, some melted margarine, and I'll coat one of my loaves with that. You can do this after the rising also. After it comes out of the oven, you can go ahead and paint your loaves, and that will soften the crust at that point. But we'll just try some different things here. So there, that looks good. And what I'll do is I'll take some more egg. I'll paint another one of the French loaves with egg. That's the old favorite, is coating them with egg. It'll give you a shiny crust, nice color. It's all for the looks. And then what we can do also is we can take just water, spray bottle of water, and just shoot our bread before it goes in the oven. Spray it with water. And then during the baking, about every 5 minutes of the baking, go ahead and open the oven, pull them out and spray them again, and that will give you a crisp crust. It'll also make the crust shiny. Now another thing we can do is we can put seeds on the bread. Here I have some poppy seeds. I'll take a handful of poppy seeds and I'll sprinkle them over my dinner rolls. It's a nice effect, and maybe on this one. Okay. And then we can also you could take sesame seeds. You can use, here's some caraway seeds. I like rye, so I have caraway seeds around. And I'll put that on one of my loaves, the one that's coated with the egg, and just a little different effect. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and bake these. I'll be baking them all at for different amounts of time. We'll go into the baking time after the fact. Baking time is really a variable depending on what goes in the oven at what time. Say if the four French loaves go in at once, or Italian loaves, whatever you want to think of them as, that's a lot of bread. That'll take a little longer to bake. If I put in just my dinner rolls, that might take a shorter period of time, but it's in a glass bowl. It'll take some time to heat up the glass. So I'll discuss baking times after the baking. Well, they look good. I'm going to go ahead and bake these off camera, and when we come back, I'll give you a shot of the finished products. Well, I've completed the baking, and they look pretty good. What I could say about cooking time is that cooking time varies. I cook these between 12 and 18 minutes depending on how many loaves I had in at once. But I just keep opening the oven, take a look. When they get dark, when they start to get browned, you know that the cooking is complete. Another thing that you can do to treat the crust is take a skillet of boiling water and set it in the bottom of your oven. This will give off steam. That's what commercial bakeries use. They cook with steam. Steam is in their oven when they're cooking. This will make your crust crisper. But be careful not to spill the water on the bottom of the oven. You may break your element if it's an electric oven. They look really good. I'll end with a close-up. Again, we've proved that you can do it at home. On the right side, the larger of the dinner rolls ended up to be hamburger buns. There was so much dough when we started that they blew up into big buns. And that concludes the second segment of our video. This is the third segment of Video Bread, And I'm going to be making whole wheat bread. Whole wheat bread is the favorite in our house. It's what we eat the most of. The kids love it with peanut butter and jelly. And I know a lot of people who just don't eat white bread. You know, when they go to the store, they'll buy a multi-grain bread, some sort of whole wheat bread. Now, in my whole wheat bread, I'm using 100% stone ground whole wheat flour. Stone ground flour, if you've ever seen an old mill, you know, the old mill down on the pond, little towns, really nice. You see a big stone, granite stone, maybe about this wide, 5 or 6 inches wide, with a hole in the center. And the stone is what grinds the flour. Today, most whole wheat flour ground commercially is ground using steel wheels. And in the grinding process, friction causes the steel wheels to heat up. And this bakes off some of the nutritional value in the flour. So I use the 100% stone ground whole wheat flour. It may cost twice as much, but it's worth it. I think it's worth the extra money. I'm going to go right to the list of ingredients. Now, doesn't that look familiar? It's really our video white bread all over again. The only thing I've done is I've substituted brown sugar for white granular sugar, and I'm substituting 4 cups of whole wheat flour for 4 cups of white flour. Something you can try at home is try a little taste test of sweeteners. I said when we made the video white bread that you can use any sweetener. Well, if you try, just take a test at home. Try a little white sugar. Sugar. A little brown sugar. Just take a taste. Brown sugar is really white sugar with some molasses in it. Honey. Just taste a little. Just so you get the idea of what flavors are available to you. What you put in the bread is, you'll get that flavor in the bread. Honey is by far, it just seems the sweetest. It has a rich, sweet flavor. And molasses is completely different. It's sweet, but at the other extreme, it's sort of a bland sweetness. Anyway, in my wheat bread, I'm going to be using brown sugar. That's a change from our video white bread. And then also, the flour, one thing I'm doing differently also, I took 4 cups of my bread flour, and I took 4 cups of the 100% stone ground wheat flour, and I put them in a separate mixing bowl. And what I'm doing is I'm pre-mixing the two together. I have a spoon with perforations in the bottom, and I'm just going to mix it in as best I can. I'm pre-mixing the 8 cups of the flour. I'm pre-mixing the whole wheat and the white flour. Now the remaining 2 cups of flour that I'll be using will be bread flour. I'll use that in my kneading. One rule in baking is that whenever you're making bread with other than all white flour, remember our video bread was all white flour, now we're using whole wheat flour. We could be using rye flour. Whenever you're using other than all white flour, you need to use at least, the rule is, you need to use at least 50% white flour. You may say, we're making whole wheat bread. Why don't we just use all whole wheat flour? Well, we can't. We have to use at least half white flour. I like to use at least 55%. But the reason is that the whole wheat flour has a low protein or gluten content. Remember, our bread flour has 14 grams of protein per cup. Our all-purpose flour has 11 grams of protein per cup. Whole wheat flour has even less grams of protein per cup than all-purpose flour. For that reason, we can't use all whole wheat flour. The bread wouldn't rise. The gas would be there, but the whole wheat flour, when mixed with the water, would not make an elasticy dough that could hold the gas, that could trap the gas for our rising. Well, there's really nothing to it. It's just video bread. We've changed the sweetener. We've pre-mixed the flour. We're using 4 cups of whole wheat flour. I'm going to go ahead and bake the bread off camera, and when I come back, I'll show you the finished product. And there they are. This is, like I say, very good everyday bread. Kids love it. Great with peanut butter and jelly. And that concludes segment 3 of Video Bread. In the 4th segment of Video Bread, we're going to be making rye bread. Rye is my favorite. I love it. I'm a rye guy. It's fabulous with Swiss cheese and mustard, corned beef, great as toast. I just love it. I'm going to go right to the list of ingredients. Surprise, surprise. It looks very similar to our video white bread. I'm calling this a caraway rye, and I've increased the yeast a bit. I'm adding an extra 2 teaspoons. I've decreased the water by 1/4 cup. I've changed the sweetener to molasses. Down the flour, we're going 9 to 11 cups versus 8 to 10 cups with our video white bread. We're using 1 cup of whole wheat flour, 3 cups of rye flour. The remainder will be white flour. And I'm using 6 tablespoons of caraway seeds. You may find that you want to use half that, 3 tablespoons of caraway seeds, or twice as much. Just a matter of taste. I like caraway. To start, I'm using 2 extra teaspoons of yeast when I hydrate my yeast. The next difference between my rye bread and the video white bread is that I take 1/4 cup of molasses, and then I'll take my 1.25 cups of water, which I have hot. It's about 130 degrees, and I'll mix the two. I'm trying to dissolve or mix the molasses and end up with a mixture at 110 degrees. Just like with our video white bread, we added our second cup, or our second 1.5 cups of water was at 110 degrees. Same here. We start with extra hot water. The molasses brings the temperature down. The hot water melts the molasses, and we end up with something 110 degrees, which is what we want. Again, we're trying to control the temperature. Okay, then when we go to the flour, I take 1 cup of whole wheat flour, put it in a bowl. I'll take 3 cups of my rye flour. I'm using a medium rye. There are a variety of types of rye. Dark rye is another good one, but I'd suggest you start with a medium rye. It's a good way to get started. And then I'll take 4 cups of bread flour. So for a total of 8 cups, I'll take my 6 tablespoons of caraway seeds, and again, I'll pre-mix the 8 cups of flour, mix the rye and the caraway and the whole wheat flour together. The remaining 3 cups of flour will be bread flour, and I'll use it in kneading. Now when I make rye bread, I don't use all-purpose flour for my white flour. I'll only make it with a bread flour because the rye flour has a very low, extremely low gluten content. Remember, the whole wheat flour had a lower gluten, lower protein content than all-purpose flour. Well, the rye flour has an even lower gluten content than the whole wheat flour. So to offset this, because we're using a really low gluten content, we have to use bread flour. We need the high protein bread flour to compensate for the fact that we're using low protein rye flour. Another thing that I'll do when I'm letting the dough rise for the second rising, the first rising is for 40 minutes, just like with the video white bread. But when it comes time to the second rising, I'll go ahead and let it go for an hour and 15 minutes, say. The bread seems to rise, and then at some point it starts to fall. Falling is an issue with rye bread. Another thing I won't do, I won't paint my rye loaves with anything, with egg. I've had it happen before. I'll have a big full loaf. I'll paint it with an egg mixture. It'll fall on me. So I won't paint it with anything. I might give it a shot of water. I might give it a shot of water after 5 minutes of cooking to make the crust darker, shiny, let's say, and crispy. I might, every 5 minutes, give it a shot of water. But rye bread is pretty temperamental. You can make it at home, and it's great, but it's probably the most complex of the breads because it's low gluten content, because of the low gluten content, and it's likely to fall. The reason that it could fall on you is because the balloons, as I think of them in the bread, when the gas is given off, the balloons can't hold the air. They blow up to a point and they break, just like a cheap balloon. That's a good way of thinking of it. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and bake the bread off camera, and when I come back, I'll show you the finished product. And there they are. They look great as usual. One thing I forgot to mention, when kneading my rye bread, I let it go, I knead for 15 minutes, which is longer than the video white bread. I do more kneading in the rye bread than any other type of bread. But these are great, great with Swiss cheese. I love it. Another thing you might try, we've done whole wheat, we've done rye. Try a combination of the two. 2 cups of rye, 2 cups of whole wheat, honey is your sweetener, everything else the same, no caraway. And friends of mine rave about it. It's their favorite. Really good stuff. And that ends the 4th segment of Video Bread. In this, the 5th segment of Video Bread, I'm going to be making pizza. I've been making pizza for about 10 years, and it's great. I can remember a friend of mine gave me a recipe way back when, and I thought it was so neat to make my own pizza. You can have a pizza in the oven 20 minutes after you begin making the pizzas. You can start by preheating your oven immediately and just go right to it. What I have here is I have 1 batch of Video Bread, everything the same, but I didn't use any oil. I didn't put any oil in this. And I put some pepper in also, about a tablespoon of pepper. And I'm going to take my dough and I'll cut it in quarters, into 4 pieces, let's say. Cut it in half first, and each of those in half again. Careful not to cut my counter. Now whenever I make pizza, I also go ahead and make some Italian bread. I'll take a nice Italian bread pan and I'll take 2 of my pieces of dough, say the smaller pieces, and just roll them out into long cylinders and make some Italian bread. What I can do then is, while I have my oven hot, I'll make a couple loaves of Italian bread, and I'll have it for garlic bread. I'll make garlic bread down the road at some point in the future. I can just take these when I'm through, bake them, and put them in the freezer, and sometime when I'm having spaghetti or pizza or whatever, I'll have some nice garlic bread with it. So I'm going to be using the equivalent of, here we go, there's our Italian bread. Set that aside. The pan is pre-greased. I'm going to be making 2 pizzas. I have here, this is the equivalent of 1 loaf of bread. If we were to roll this out and put it in a bread pan, we'd have 1 loaf of our Video Bread. I cut it in half, and I'm going to make 2 pizzas. Now I could just as easily have cut this in thirds and made 3 pizzas. I'm going to make a thick crust pizza though, so I'll use this amount of dough for 2 pizzas. Your basic pizza pan I picked up for a little over $3 in a local store, and I'll also be using a cookie sheet. You can use any pan really. You can use the bottom of a roasting pan, you can use a skillet, a glass baking dish, anything you want. I'll go ahead and take my dough, put it on my pan, and just start stretching the dough to come to the shape of the pan. Now, if you've noticed, you've seen people on TV, they take the dough and start going like this. Don't ask me what they're doing, but I don't bother that. Okay, I'll just stretch the dough out. One of the tricks in pizza is a hot oven. I preheat my oven to 425 degrees, and you can go ahead and try 450. If you have a cooking stone, a baking stone, it's good with a pizza. If you're not familiar with a baking stone, it's say about 2 foot by 1.5 foot. They come in different sizes, and maybe about 3/4, half an inch to 3/4 of an inch thick. And it's just a stone that absorbs the heat in the oven. And when you put your pizza pan then, or a bread pan on the hot stone, it cooks from the bottom then, which is good. If you buy pizzas in a store, in a little pizza shop, they use a pizza oven. It's a hot oven, real hot oven, and they slide the pizza right onto the hot oven, and it does cook from the bottom. We can't do that at home, but we can make a pretty mean pizza just the same in your regular everyday oven. That's what I'll be using. Okay, there's one ready. Now these will be thick crust pizzas because I'm using a lot of dough. Like I say, I could have taken this amount of dough and used 3 pizzas. I'm making only 2 pizzas. So that will make we're using a lot of dough, it'll be thick. Another trick for coming up with thick pizzas is letting the pizza stand for a while. Let the dough rise, just like with a loaf of bread. The longer you let it sit and rise, the thicker the crust will be. If you want a thin crust, you could bake it immediately. Don't give it any time at all to rise. And when you're making your pizzas, you're going to be cooking them one at a time, so the second one will be a thicker crust. The second one in the oven will have more time to rise, and it'll end up being a thicker crust pizza. Now what I did with my sauce, I normally take a can of tomato sauce and I just put the sauce on the pizza and then sprinkle some Italian seasoning on. Or I made some sauce earlier today. I took tomato sauce again, put the Italian seasoning in, and I simmered it on the stove. The simmering releases the flavor in the seasoning and gives you more flavor in the sauce. It takes more time. You don't have to do that, but that's what I did. It makes a better pizza. That's how I make my spaghetti sauce also. I just take sauce, I put in the Italian seasoning and cook it a bit. Works out great. Maybe put in a few mushrooms or onions, whatever you have, however you like it. Well, that looks pretty good. Well, I'm about ready to start adding the sauce. Stretch them out just a little bit more. Great, that one looks good. Okay, I'll take my sauce. You can use a lot of sauce or just a little bit of sauce. It's up to you. I'll use a lot of sauce on these. And just spread it around as best I can. Looks good. Okay, these are looking really good, really good. Spread my sauce around. I'll add a little more here. May as well use the rest. Great. And next I'll be putting my cheese on. I buy everything in quantity. I bought my cheese in 5-pound packages. And here we go. I just sliced the cheese. I used a cheese slicer. And I'll just put some pieces of cheese on, all across the top of the pizza, no particular order. You can use as much cheese or as little as you like. It's like I have too much cheese here, so I'll have some for my later pizzas. Okay, that's looking good. Now when you make pizzas at home, you can use anything you want. You can use sausage, pepperoni, mushrooms, olives, onions, green peppers, anything you want really, anchovies, pineapples, Canadian bacon. I'm just going to make cheese, pepperoni, and I have some green pepper. I'll go ahead and add a little green pepper too. Make a nice little pizza here. You say these are fast pizzas. You can have a pizza in the oven in 20 minutes. I let my dough rise once, like we did with our video bread, but you don't need to. You can make your dough, knead your dough and immediately press it out on the pans and without the first rising. You don't need to bother with the first rising. Okay, I'll go ahead and put on the pepperoni now. And I buy my pepperoni in quantity also. I buy a 2-pound bag of pre-sliced pepperoni, which I get at a warehouse store, a membership store. It's a pretty good price. I basically buy my ingredients for all my baking. I shop around and see who has what. I usually buy in quantity, and when I locate my source, I just buy from that point on. That's where I'll get my pepperoni or my cheese or flour or whatever. Okay, that looks pretty good. Put on the rest of the pepperoni here. Get ready and put on some green peppers. I'll just sprinkle on the green pepper. Great. Now at this point I could put on some Parmesan cheese, but I won't. Okay, they look really good. They're all ready to bake. Now what I'm going to do is I'll go ahead and bake these off camera, and when I come back I'll show you the finished product. They look great. 2 beautiful pizzas. I cook them for about 15 minutes each. And my bread. Nice loaf of Italian bread. And what I like to do with my Italian bread, now I'm going to make garlic bread. I'll take it and I'll slice diagonally. Slice the bread into sections maybe 3/4 of an inch thick. Take some butter, and I'll butter each side of the bread, each side of each slice of bread. And then I'll sprinkle a little garlic salt on the butter. After the bread has been baked, I'll wrap it then in aluminum foil and put it in my freezer. And that's all set then to be popped in the oven sometime when I have pizza again or spaghetti. That's my garlic bread. Makes real nice garlic bread. Like I say, hot oven. Hot oven is a key in pizza. Another thing, thick versus thin crust. If you want a thick crust, use more dough. I could have made 3 pizzas. I made 2. So this is a thicker crust. I also left the dough rise for a bit. You can watch it rise. You can let it go 10 minutes before baking. You can let it go 20, 30, whatever. You can make the crust as thick as you want. These are really thick crusts. What I'll do now is I'll give you a close-up, show you the bottom of one of these, and just give you a close-up of the pizzas. They really look good. I love pizza. And it's really cost-effective to make it at home. Rather than pay 10 or 12 bucks to have a pizza delivered to the house, these pizzas cost a little over $1 each. Great for feeding a family. I'll give you that close-up. They look nice. Look at that crust. Isn't that beautiful? One thing I could mention here, this cookie sheet it's old and it's dark looking just from cooking, baked on the oil and all, versus a brand new silver pan. The darker the pan, the darker the crust. If you use a bread pan, if you use a coated bread pan that's a dark pan, you'll have a nice loaf of bread. If you use the less expensive silver pans, you're going to have a problem. It won't bake on the bottom. You'll have to cook it an extra long time, and I just recommend not using the silver bread pans. Use a dark, a no-stick surface pan. The darker the better. And they look pretty good. The garlic bread's a nice trick. With that, we'll end segment 5. In this, the 6th segment of Video Bread, I'm going to be making cinnamon rolls. Cinnamon rolls are delicious. There's nothing better than hot cinnamon rolls, homemade, right out of the oven. Let's go right to our list of ingredients. Topping our list is 3 tablespoons of yeast. We'll mix that with 1 cup of water at 110 degrees. We'll hydrate the yeast, let it soak for 7 minutes. Then we'll add 2 cups of milk at 110 degrees. I bring it to temperature in my microwave. 4 tablespoons of honey, you could use sugar, 2 teaspoons of salt, 6 eggs, and 1 tablespoon of oil. To that we'll add 4 of our 8 to 10 cups of flour, and then we'll take our electric beater and beat it to thoroughly mix the yeast. We'll add the remainder of our 8 to 10 cups of flour, and we'll knead for between 5 and 10 minutes. We'll place the dough in a greased bowl until it doubles in size. Let it rise, the first rising, for about 40 minutes. At that time we'll punch down the dough. I'll show that part on camera. We'll punch down the dough, cut it in 3 sections, and then roll it out into rectangles. We'll put the margarine on each of the rectangles, then we'll add the sugar and cinnamon mixture, sprinkle on our raisins, roll them up and cut them into 1-inch sections. And I'll demonstrate all that in a minute here. The icing is pretty simple. It's powdered sugar, milk, and vanilla. I'll be using 8 cups of powdered sugar, 8 to 9 tablespoons of milk, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla. And this recipe, this is a big recipe. This will make between 3 and 4 dozen cinnamon rolls. You may want to make half of this recipe. Going to punch down the dough. It's the end of the first rising. Rose beautifully. And I'm going to cut the dough into 3 pieces. Careful not to cut my counter. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and demonstrate on one of the pieces of dough. I'll roll it out into a rectangle. Roll it as best I can. And what we're going to do then is we're going to put the butter on it. I'll just put it on by hand. My margarine. Then I'll put on the sugar and cinnamon. I've mixed the sugar and the cinnamon. The 2 tablespoons of cinnamon with the cup of sugar mixed here in a bowl. Got my raisins, my cup of butter. And this is how we make our cinnamon raisin rolls. Rolling it out into a rectangle. Pretty simple. And that looks pretty good. Okay, now I'll take my butter and I'll just take it by hand and I'm just painting the butter. Just taking a handful of the soft butter and I'm making a big mess. Great, very good. Okay, let me wipe my hands off here a bit. And now I'm going to put on some of the cinnamon sugar mixture, and I'll use about 1/3. Remember, we cut our dough into 3 pieces, so this sugar cinnamon mixture has to go for all 3 pieces of dough. And that's looking real good. Great. Now I'll go ahead and I'll put on 1/3 of the raisins. I like a lot of raisins, so there we go. That's it. Now what I'm going to do is roll up the cinnamon roll. And not at all complicated. We'll just roll it up as tightly as possible, but it doesn't matter. We really can't mess things up at this point. And there we have it. Now what we're going to do is slice it into, say, 1-inch sections. I'll just start in the middle. And nice 1-inch sections. Trying not to score my counter, cut my counter here. Looks good. Pretty fast operation. Using a serrated knife, anytime I'm dealing with bread baking, I'm always using a serrated knife. It's easy to cut things with. Okay, now I've got a greased cookie tin, and I'm going to go ahead and place some of the sweet rolls on the cookie tin. I'm going to put 8 on a cookie tin. And there you have it. That's the basic idea. I'll go ahead and roll out the rest of the dough, put on the butter, the sugar, cinnamon, and the raisins. And I can show you at other stages of completion. Here's some that have risen already. I'll give you close-ups here in a minute. Here's some that have been cooked. I bake them at 350 degrees for 20 minutes. And, let's see. Okay, here's some that I've put the icing on. Like I say, I'll give you close-ups in a bit here. Really a pretty simple operation. Now to put on the icing, what we can do, here's my icing, which is simply confectioner's sugar, milk, as much milk as it needs, and a little vanilla for a little more flavor. And basically, I just take some and just paint it on as best I can. You can make your frosting, the icing, thick or thin, whichever you like. I like a nice thick frosting. These are great fresh, but you can microwave them the next day also, and they're really good. So applying the icing isn't that complicated. Just goop some on. There we go. So basically that's it. We have our, I'll let these rise for an hour and a half. I'll go ahead and roll out all the dough, and I'll have a lot of cookie tins full of sweet rolls. They will, after an hour and a half, they'll blow up, rise to about this size. Then I'll go ahead and bake them at 350 for 20 minutes. I'll let them cool for a while, and then I'll go ahead and put the icing on them. I'll give you a close-up. They look great. These have yet to rise. These have risen for an hour and a half and are ready to be baked. These have been baked, and I've just put the icing on them. After the icing sets up for a bit, don't those look good? That's what it's all about. And that concludes the 6th segment of Video Bread. In this, the 7th segment of Video Bread, I'm going to be making a pie crust. I have a great recipe here. It's really simple, fast, and if you don't know how to make pies, I'm going to make a banana cream and an apple pie. Great, great recipe. I'm going to be using 2 cups of all-purpose flour. Can't use a bread flour, it'll come out tough. All-purpose flour. A half a teaspoon of salt, a half a cup of oil. I use a vegetable oil, a liquid shortening, and a quarter of a cup of milk. I've got my 2 cups of all-purpose flour in my bowl, and to that I'll add a half a teaspoon of salt for a little flavor, and I'll mix those two together. I'll mix the dry ingredients a bit, and then I'll go ahead and add, I've got a half a cup of oil and a quarter of a cup of milk. Mix that up a bit, just dump it in, that's it. That's our pie crust. Stir that up now. And that's a simple pie crust. Some flour, 2 cups of flour, a little salt for flavor, some oil and some milk. And this makes a great, great pie crust, and it's so fast. Okay, I'll finish the rest by hand. I'll form it into a ball by hand. Now what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to make an apple pie and a banana cream pie. On the banana pie, I've already made the crust, and I baked it. I made the crust as we'll be doing, and I baked it for about a half an hour at 350. For our apple pie, we'll bake the crust when we bake the pie. So this, I'm making an apple pie right now. Great. And here's my ball of dough. I'll cut it in two pieces, one a little bigger than the other. The bigger of the two will be the bottom of the pie, and the other piece will be the top of the pie, the covering for the apple pie. And what I do is I'll take two pieces of wax paper, lay it out on my counter. I'll put my ball of dough over the wax paper, and I'll press it out, start forming it into a circle. This makes a really light, flaky pie crust also. It's a really good recipe. Okay, and then I'll take two pieces of wax paper and put it over the top, roll it out with my rolling pin into a circle. And what I'm going to do then is I want it to be the shape of the pie. So I want it to be about this big, a little bigger than this circle. Great. Roll this out with my rolling pin. It's nice with the wax paper. I've seen a variety of techniques used in cookbooks, but this works great. Between two pieces of wax paper, you can't go wrong. Okay. Now what I'm going to do is I'll remove the wax paper. Maybe I'll cut and paste a piece here. I'll cut one piece off and put it up in this section to make a better circle. And I can roll that out a bit. Good. Okay, I'll set my wax paper aside. I'll be using this for the top of the pie crust also. Take my pie plate, put it over the crust. It fits. That's perfect. And I'll just flip it around. Remove the wax paper carefully. Careful not to rip the pie crust. And there we go. I'll just form it, shape it into the pie plate. Then I'll take a knife, a nice sharp knife, cut around the edges, cut and trim. And the pieces I have left, I'll use to patch where I need a little more dough. It wasn't a perfect circle. You can see I need a little dough here, and I need some dough on this side, and I'll go ahead and use some of these extra pieces to patch. There we go. Put a patch on this side. This recipe is just so fast. It's uncomplicated. And if you like pies, pies are so easy, so fast to make. There's no reason not to be able to make a nice pie. You can make all sorts of pies. Strawberry rhubarb is a good one. I recommend that you get a cookbook, and now that you know a pie crust recipe, you can go ahead and make some nice pies. Like I say, I'll demonstrate an apple and a banana cream pie. There we go. That's ready. Okay, what I'll do is I'll roll the top off camera. Right now I'm going to give you the recipe for the two pies I'll be making. Apple pie, I'll be using between 6 and 7 large Granny Smith apples. Those are the green ones. I'll use about a tablespoon of lemon juice, which I'll squirt over the apples. And then my dry ingredients I'll mix together. There'll be a half a cup of sugar, a teaspoon of cinnamon, quarter teaspoon of nutmeg, and 2 tablespoons of flour. Now my banana pie, I'm going to slice about 3 bananas and put those in the bottom of the pie crust. The crust will be pre-baked and cooled. And then I'll just take a package, 5¼ ounce packet of instant pie filling mix, banana cream for banana pie, and I'll mix that with 3 cups of milk. The directions are right on the package. Use my electric beater, beat for about a minute. Pour that right over the bananas in the pie shell, and then I'll go ahead and take a ½ pint of heavy whipping cream, and I'll beat that with my electric beater until it stiffens up, and I'll put that on the top of the pie. We'll go ahead and make our banana pie first. Say I have a pre-baked shell, same shell pie crust I made before. I baked it for ½ an hour and let it cool. I peeled about 3 bananas, sliced them, and I'll just put the bananas on the bottom of the shell, Then I'll take my instant banana pie filling, which I beat. The directions are on the box. I beat it for about a minute until it thickens. And I'll put that over the bananas in the shell. And then we'll go ahead and add our whipped cream. There we go. Now I used a heavy whipping cream and took my electric beater again, and I beat the whipping cream for about a minute until it started to stiffen up. And I'll put my whipped cream on the top. And that's looking good, looking good. Great. Okay. That's just how fast the pie is. I can lick the spoon, I'm the cook. Great. 1 banana cream pie. I'll go ahead and put this in the refrigerator to let it set up. It should be served cold. Now for our apple pie, here's the crust we just made. On any pie, when you bake a crust for a cream pie or the apple pie, I like to put some little cuts in the bottom of the crust. Then I'll go ahead and take my apples. I have about 6 apples, Granny Smiths, that I peeled. And I'll put these in the pie. And as you can see, they're piled very high. It looks now like I used too many apples. But when they cook, they'll bake down. And when I cook an apple pie in the oven, I always cook on a cookie sheet because some of the juice will drip off. Now I'll take my tablespoon of lemon juice and I'll put that over the apples. That looks like about a tablespoon of lemon juice. I've got a half a cup of sugar, and I've got a half a teaspoon of cinnamon. I've got a 1/4 teaspoon of nutmeg and 2 tablespoons of flour. Those are my dry ingredients, and I'll mix them. Mix those up a bit, and I'm going to sprinkle this over the apples, and I'm ready then to put the top on the apple pie. This is a quick apple pie recipe. Now you can get a cookbook. Like I say, now that you have this easy pie crust recipe, get yourself a cookbook, and strawberry rhubarb is great. Chocolate pies are easy. All your cream pies are really easy. But you can make some really nice pies. Okay, simple. I sprinkled my dry ingredients over the apples. Now I'll take my crust. I rolled this out off camera. This is the top for the pie, and I'll carefully put it over the top of the pie. And this looks like a big apple pie. It is. But it will cook down, like I say. And I'll go ahead and cut and paste. Great. I'll patch this up off camera. I'll give you a close-up of the 2 pies. Then I'll bake this one also. What I'd like to do too is I'll put some cuts in the top of the pie. There they are. The apple pie is ready to be baked. I'll go ahead and bake it at 375 for about an hour, 50 minutes to an hour, and I'll bake it on a cookie sheet. The cream pie is ready to eat, but I'll put it in the refrigerator. It's best served cold. When I come back, I'll give you a close-up on the baked apple pie. There they are. They look great. The apple pie I baked at 375 for about an hour. And the cream pie we just put in the refrigerator. They're great. Get a cookbook. Now that you have a recipe for a quick, easy pie crust, you can make a variety of pies. They're really easy to make. And that concludes the 7th segment of Video Bread. In this, the 8th and final segment of Video Bread, I'm going to be giving a narrative on nutrition, cost and source, and then a little summary. I'll just show some scenes here from around the Las Vegas area while I talk. Our bread is very nutritious. Bread is the staff of life. You could live on bread and water, fresh fruits and vegetables, and maybe a little cheese, some additional protein. Really good for you. We're using 100% stone ground whole wheat flour. That's the whole wheat berry. Very nutritious. It includes the wheat germ and the wheat bran. Even our bread flour, a white flour, is nutritious. It hasn't been bleached and then enriched. The nutrition hasn't been removed and then added back. It's all natural. Some other things you can try for flavor, or if you're into health, to make it more nutritious, try adding a little extra wheat germ. You can try some different flours, barley flour, buckwheat flour. You can try stone ground cornmeal. Really good. When I put cornmeal in my bread, I like to cook it in water first to make it dissolve, turn into a mush, and then I'll add it in my mixture. But you can leave it in its gritty form. Millet is ground into flour. Oats are ground into flour, or you can use rolled oats. You can get rice flour. We've already used rye flour. And another trick with your rye flour, when making rye bread, you might want to try using half as much rye flour and then get some caraway powder and add caraway powder to get more of that caraway flavor along with your caraway seeds. You can get the caraway powder at the same place where you'll get your 50-pound bags of flour. Wheat comes in two types, what I think of a hard wheat or a soft wheat. If you hear the term, a hard wheat is a bread flour. It's a high protein, high gluten flour. That's what we use in our bread. In a pie crust, we'd use our soft wheat flour and all-purpose flour. The oil that I use is vegetable oil, no animal fats. I use water. I don't use milk, no cholesterol. I can limit the salt. When I'm making my own bread, you can add as little or as much salt as you want. Sometimes I'll save potato water from making mashed potatoes. I'll put it in my refrigerator and then use it in making my bread. Really good for you. And the sweeteners, you can stay away from white sugar. Go exclusively with honey. Use nothing but honey as your sweetener, or maybe some molasses. A lot of things you can do. Bread is very nutritious, and it's not fattening. Remember, in a loaf of bread, we're only using 1/8 of a cup of sweetener and 1.5 tablespoons of oil. And these are big, full loaves. Really nutritious. Really good for you. Regarding cost and source, a loaf of bread costs $1 to make. That's a really good deal. A pizza costs a little over $1. Another really good deal. But to get those prices, you have to buy in quantity. I buy my yeast in 2-pound packages. I buy my pepperoni pre-sliced in 2-pound packages. I buy my cheese in 5-pound blocks, and then I cut it before I freeze it into 5 pieces, put those in plastic bags, store them in the freezer. And I buy those items at a membership store, a store that sells to businesses and the public, a warehouse type of store. Now for my flour, to get my 50-pound bags of flour and my caraway seeds, I go to a food broker, a wholesaler, or a food distributor. And to find these people in your area, you'll need to get the phone book. Look in the yellow pages under food, brokers, distributors, and wholesalers. Call around and see who locally carries 50-pound bags of bread flour. Someone in your area does. If you're in the city or the country, you'll need to go into city, and someone's carrying this flour. They're supplying pizza shops, donut shops, people who make wedding cakes, small caterers. And what you do to buy from these people, once you find out who they are, give them a call and get pricing on your flour. The type of flour you want now is ask for a bread flour. It's a high gluten, high protein flour. 3 brand names that I'm familiar with are Power Flour, Full Power, and Cryo. Starts with a K. Also, you'll want to get a 50-pound bag of 100% stone ground whole wheat flour. And then if you're going to get into rye breads, there are different types of rye. You can get a light rye, a medium rye, or a dark rye. That's the color. I suggest you start with a medium rye and go with a 50-pound bag. Also the caraway seeds and caraway powder you'll get from these people. Now how you buy from them is you call them, order a bag of Power flour and one bag of 100% stone ground whole wheat, and say put it on will call. That means that you will call, you will come to their place of business and pick it up and pay cash. Don't be intimidated if these people ask who are you. They want to know if you have an account for them. You don't, but they're very willing to sell to you, just like any caterer or anyone else. If you go in and buy 2 or 3 bags of flour, they're very happy for the business. But to get these prices, you need to buy the flour in that quantity. Price isn't the issue. A price for any one of these bags of flour is about $10, between $9 and $11. You really don't need to shop for price. You just want to get it. And once you have your flour, you're rolling. While you're dealing with these people, get yourself an inventory list, a product list, catalog whatever of the products that they carry. You might find some other items that you use regularly that you're willing to buy in quantity and stock. These are the same people who supply the grocery stores. Incredible price breaks buying from these people. Caraway seeds you can get at 1/20th the price that you'll pay in a grocery store. The price of 5 or 10 pounds of rye flour in a health food store might be the same as a 50-pound bag at one of these distributors. You might want to stock, as an example, chocolate chips. If you make chocolate chip cookies, you might want to buy a supply of chocolate chips. They keep, if you have the room. It's up to you. And in conclusion, just to summarize a bit, we've learned some things about baking, working with the yeast, hydrating the yeast, controlling the temperature, the amount of yeast, a lot of tricks in the baking. We want to use these principles in baking. I'm using a tablespoon of yeast for about 4 cups of flour. A little more if I'm using a rye flour, a low gluten flour, I'll have to supplement with a little more yeast. Yeast is very important. Another rule is when you're making bread with other than all white flour, you need to use at least 50 to 60%, say, white flour, because you need the high gluten content in your bread. Get yourself a cookbook. Go to the store. Pick up a loaf of bread. Read the ingredients. Try making it at home. You know how to make bread now. If you've worked through the tape, you can make bread. You see there, you add their flavorings. Try putting dill in a rye. You know, so put different roll out some dough and put some things in there like you would making your sweet dough. Put in some vegetables or something and roll it up and see what you have. Experiment, play around, get wild. You know, it's your bread. It's fun. Bread baking is fun. You can use make a wheat bread pizza. Take your sweet dough and braid it, bake it, put the icing on the top with slivered almonds. Get out some cookbooks, buy a cookbook, go to the library, try sourdough. Sourdough is great. Some people have kept sourdough starters going for 80 years. Get into sourdough, get a starter going, get a cookbook, experiment, enjoy. I hope you've enjoyed the video. I've really enjoyed making it, and I hope that everyone makes great bread, that you really get into making the bread, and that your family enjoys the bread. Thank you very much.